My name is Tessa Myers. I'm 36 years old, and the spring we buried my grandmother, my mother demanded a DNA test on my 7-year-old son to keep him out of the will. I said yes before she finished her sentence. She expected tears. She expected begging. She'd spent weeks telling half the county that my boy wasn't blood, and now she wanted a laboratory to make it official. So we swabbed. We signed. We waited. 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday, the lab called my cell phone. They didn't want to talk about my son. They wanted to talk about the sample my mother had submitted as her own. What sat inside that report didn't just end her claim on my grandmother's estate. It cracked open a lie my mother had guarded for 40 years, a lie our whole family had been living inside without knowing it, and it landed, first and hardest, on the woman who dug the hole. But that phone call only makes sense from the beginning, from what my mother tried to take, and how carefully she built the trap that caught her. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet women finally tell the family stories they carried in silence, the betrayals, the boundaries, and the moment everything turns. If you've ever had to stand your ground with the people who raised you, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. To picture my life, picture apples. I live in Hartwell, Michigan, a fruit-ridge town where the school calendar bends around harvest and everybody's casserole dish has a last name taped to the bottom. I've been a pediatric nurse for 12 years. I've been a widow for 3. My husband Ryan hit black ice coming home from a job in 2023, and since then it's been me and our son Caleb, who is 7, loves grafting knives more than video games, and works twice as hard as any kid I know just to get a long sentence out. The center of my world was never my mother's house 2 miles away. It was my grandmother's farmhouse, white clapboard and 140 acres of orchard, 4 miles out on Herrick Road. Ruth Herrick raised apples for 60 years and raised me on the side, every summer, every broken season of my life. This February, at 90, her heart started failing, and I took family leave and nursed her through hospice in the room where she'd been born. The last clear night she gripped my hand with surprising strength. Her eyes went sharp, the way dying people's eyes sometimes do, like fog burning off. She said, "If Dana ever turns on that boy, ask your mother about the winter of '63. I said, "Grandma, what happened in '63? She looked at me like the answer was sitting on her tongue, heavy as a stone she'd carried too far to set down. Then the morphine pulled her under, and she never surfaced long enough to finish. She died on a Sunday morning in March with snow still on the orchard. I wrote the words on a scrap of paper. The winter of '63. I had no idea I was holding a key. A word about my mother, because everything she did next grew straight out of who she is. Dana Calloway, born Dana Herrick, is 62, president of the Women's Guild at First Lutheran, and the self-appointed keeper of the Herrick family line. She kept the family Bible with the births inked in. She could recite the pedigree back 4 generations the way other people recite recipes. Her love came with a scoreboard. I made honor roll. She asked why not valedictorian. I became a nurse. She asked why not a doctor. I married a good man. She asked about his people. My whole childhood was an exam I could pass and never ace, and I kept sitting for it anyway, year after year, because some part of me believed the grade was coming. Her favorite saying, she'd say it holding her coffee, calm as a preacher, was always the same. "Blood doesn't lie, sweetheart." She said it about a cousin's divorce, about a neighbor's adopted daughter, about anybody whose belongings she'd decided to audit. And after Caleb was born through IVF, she started saying it near me. She never once called the clinic by its name. She called it that place, and she called my son that clinic baby, quietly, the way you'd flick lint off a coat. I corrected her every single time, and she'd smile and pour more coffee. But it stayed small, an ugly hobby, until Grandma Ruth died and there was suddenly an estate on the table. At the funeral lunch, I heard my mother across the fellowship hall, telling her guild ladies about the will that hadn't even been read yet. And I noticed she'd stopped using Caleb's name entirely. She called him the boy. Twice. My mother is precise with words. That's when my stomach started bracing. Marjorie Bell has handled Herrick paperwork for 30 years, from a little brick office across from the courthouse. The Thursday after the funeral we gathered there. My mother, her brother Gene, his wife Pam, their daughter Josie, and me with Caleb's booster seat still in my car. Ruth's trust was simple and stubborn, like Ruth. The orchard operation split between her two children, Dana and Jean, half and half. An education fund of $25,000 for each great-grandchild, Caleb, and Josie's two little ones. My mother nodded along, gracious, already composing the version she'd tell at church. Then Marjorie turned the page. The farmhouse, and the 12 acres of original orchard around it, to my great-grandson Caleb Myers, held in trust until his 25th birthday, with my granddaughter Tessa as caretaker until then. The room went so quiet I could hear the radiator tick. Jean let out a low whistle and grinned at me. Josie squeezed my hand. My mother did not move. The farmhouse was the crown of everything. The house her mother was born in, the house she'd already told her guild she would be restoring. And Ruth had reached past her, past me, and set it in the hands of a 7-year-old with a grafting knife. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was pleasant, which is how I knew it was dangerous. Marjorie, she said, smoothing her skirt, how does the trust define a descendant exactly? Marjorie glanced up over her glasses. There was a pause I didn't understand yet, a pause with a history in it. Walter added language back in '98. Marjorie said carefully. It reads, Descendants of Walter and Ruth Herrick by blood. My mother smiled at the table. There it is, she said softly. There it is. She invited the whole family for what she called a healing dinner the next Sunday. At her house, pot roast and good china, and she waited until the pie was served to start the surgery. Caleb was in the den with Josie's kids, watching cartoons, mercifully out of earshot. My mother set down her fork and announced that before anybody transferred a house to anybody, the family deserved certainty. You all remember Tessa went through that place in Grand Rapids, she said. The shots, the lab dishes, all of it. And you've all seen the boy? Strawberry blonde in this family. She let it hang there like she'd proven a theorem. Then she said she'd found a pamphlet, years ago, at my own kitchen counter, a brochure about donated embryos, from that place, and that a grieving family couldn't be too careful with a 140-acre legacy. I told her, evenly, that the pamphlet came in the clinic's welcome folder, the same folder every patient gets, and that Caleb was made from me and from Ryan, and that Ryan's grandmother had hair like a peach in every photograph ever taken of her. My mother tilted her head with that terrible patience of hers. Then you won't mind being sure, she said. We should be certain the boy is actually family before we hand him Mama's house. I looked around the table, at Gene studying his pie, at Pam blinking, at Josie's husband suddenly fascinated by his napkin, and I waited for one grown adult to say the obvious out loud, that a woman was auditing her own grandson's veins over dessert. Nobody did. The furnace hummed. Somewhere in the den, a cartoon laughed, and I understood I was going to be standing in this alone. Here is what my mother was spitting on, for anyone who hasn't lived it. Ryan and I married in 2015, in Ruth's orchard, under trees so heavy with blossom the photographer kept laughing. In 2016, I had an ectopic pregnancy that ruptured on a Tuesday night shift, and I lost the pregnancy, a fallopian tube, and almost my life on a table at my own hospital. We saved for 2 years after that. In 2018, we did IVF in Grand Rapids. My eggs, retrieved from my body while Ryan held my hand and made terrible jokes about the paper gown. My embryo, transferred fresh that same season. I have never been more certain of anything than I was of the origin of my son, because I paid for that certainty in needles and grief. Caleb was born in March of 2019, and Ryan cried so hard a nurse brought him juice. So no, the rumor didn't scare me on the facts. But I'm not naive about how rumors work, and I'd already acted once. Back in 2019, when my mother-in-law garbled some story about the clinic offering donor options after a failed cycle, a conversation that never happened, I requested our full embryology records, read every page, and filed them in the fire safe. When my mother resurrected the lie this spring, I called the clinic the very next morning to get a fresh certified copy. That's when I learned the clinic had merged with a health system in 2024. Records requests were running 60 to 90 days, minimum. One polite voice told me, and certified copies were taking longer. 60 to 90 days. Remember that number. Because my mother, it turned out, was not planning to wait that long. And neither was her lawyer. The certified letter arrived on a Friday, addressed to Marjorie Bell with copies to all beneficiaries, from a lawyer 2 towns over. On behalf of Dana Calloway, it formally objected to any distribution to Caleb Myers, absent proof that the minor qualified as a lineal descendant by blood under the 1998 amendment. There was Walter's phrase again, weaponized, and I finally understood the pause in Marjorie's office. My mother had gone looking for that language, and she'd found it waiting for her like a loaded shotgun above a door. But the letter was only half the move. The other half came quietly, the way she liked. As trustee, my mother had authority over the education funds, and she exercised it. Disbursements suspended pending resolution of eligibility questions, her lawyer wrote. That fund was paying for Caleb's speech therapy, $180 a session, twice a week, with a therapist who had finally gotten my son to stop swallowing the ends of his sentences. I did the math at my kitchen table at midnight, the way widows do, and started picking up extra shifts. I called the clinic again about the embryology records. Still in the queue, still 60 to 90 days, the same polite voice. And anyway, Marjorie warned me gently, medical paperwork wouldn't settle a challenge like this one. Courts and estate lawyers trust one thing in a parentage dispute, she said, and it isn't a folder from a fire safe. It's an accredited kinship test, chain of custody, collected under supervision, results binding on everybody. I sat with that for a moment. My mother wanted a blood trial. Marjorie was telling me the fastest way out was straight through it. Fine, I thought, fine. Let's go through it. Marjorie called a family meeting at her office to discuss the objection, and my mother arrived dressed for a verdict. Navy suit, church pearls, her lawyer's card tucked in her purse like a talisman. She had clearly rehearsed for resistance. She opened with a speech about stewardship and legacy and how much it pained her, and then she laid it down like a trump card. Unless Tessa consents to genetic testing, this family will never. And I said yes, right there, over the top of her sentence. Every face swung to me, waiting for the explosion that didn't come. My mother blinked. I said it again, slower, so the room could keep up. Yes. An accredited lab, full chain of custody, samples collected under supervision, results binding on every single one of us, in writing. When do we swab? For half a second, and I will keep that half second like a pressed flower. My mother's certainty flickered. Then the mask reset, and she reached over and patted my hand. Blood doesn't lie, sweetheart, she said. Marjorie cleared her throat and turned lawyerly. Since the standard being invoked was descendants of Walter and Ruth by blood, testing Caleb against me alone wouldn't answer the legal question. The lab would want a family reference panel for the Herrick line, she explained, a sample from Dana, as Ruth's daughter, and ideally one from Jean, as Ruth's son, to anchor the lineage from both children. My mother answered before Marjorie had even finished the sentence. Mine will be enough, she said. No hesitation. No breath, the words out and dressed before anyone else's thoughts had shoes on. Jean shrugged. Pam checked her watch, and the meeting moved on to scheduling. But driving home, I kept snagging on it. She'd been eager. My mother is never eager. And I couldn't yet figure out why. If my mother is the family's judge, her brother Jean is its barn. Jean Herrick is 58. Runs the orchards day to day with hands like tree bark, and distrusts any document longer than a seed invoice. I drove out to the orchard that week and found him on a ladder in the Honeycrisp rows, and he came down slow and hugged me with one arm, the way he does. We don't blood test family like cattle, Dana, he'd told my mother at the meeting. Flat. No anger in it. Which from Jean is a filibuster. But he'd agreed to give a sample anyway, if the lawyer asked, because in his arithmetic anything that ended the war fastest was worth a cheek swab. Pam was less serene. The frozen education funds touched Josie's 2 kids as well, collateral damage nobody talked about at church, and Pam had opinions about a trustee freezing her own grandchildren's money to spite a third one. Jean mostly wanted to talk about Caleb. He'd promised the boy they'd graft the old wild rose come spring, teach him to set a scion properly, and Jean keeps promises the way other men keep trucks. Before I left, he wiped his hands and said something that snagged in me and stayed. You know, when we were kids, Mama used to disappear every December, he said. Just for a day. Took the car. Told nobody. Dad never asked. So we never asked. I used to figure she was mourning somebody. Never did learn who. He shrugged and went back up the ladder. An easy man at ease. No idea he'd just handed me a puzzle piece. December. Every year. A grief with no name on it. I put it on the shelf in my head next to the winter of '63, and the shelf creaked. 9 days before our collection appointment, my mother came to my house alone. She sat at my kitchen table, accepted coffee she didn't drink, and slid a folded check across the wood like a woman feeding a parking meter. $40,000. Her terms were dressed as kindness. I would decline the farmhouse on Caleb's behalf, quietly, no test needed, and the family would knit itself back together, and she would personally see the education fund released by Monday. Think what that money does for you now, she said, glancing around my kitchen at the widowhood of it all, the single income, the coupon drawer. She wasn't wrong about the arithmetic. $40,000 was a year of therapy sessions, a new roof, oxygen. That's what made it obscene. I turned the check around with one finger and slid it back. I asked her the question I'd been carrying since Marjorie's office. If you're so sure he isn't blood, why are you paying to stop the test? The pleasantness dropped off her face like a shelf of snow off a roof. For a second I saw something underneath I didn't have a name for yet. Not anger. I see anger every shift. Parents in emergency rooms have taught me all its faces. This was older and colder. It looked, if anything, like fear that had learned excellent posture. Some things don't need a lab, Tessa, she said, gathering her purse. They need to stay closed. Then she was gone. Heels crisp on my porch steps, leaving her coffee full and her sentence open. I stood at the window watching her taillights and realized I'd stopped asking whether my mother believed her own rumor. I'd started asking what else she knew that I didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with 2 piles in front of me, the practical and the true, and let them fight. Take the check, and Caleb keeps his therapist and loses something I couldn't buy back, because in Hartwell, declining that test would harden every whisper into fact, and my son would grow up as the boy they paid off, the asterisk in the Herrick Bible, guilty by settlement. Refuse, and I was betting my kid's stability on a laboratory. Around 3 a.m, I caught myself rehearsing how I'd explain the check to my mother's satisfaction, polishing my answers for her scoreboard the way I'd done my whole life, and something in me went very still and very tired. I was 36 years old and still sitting her exam. That, more than anything, is what decided it. Monday morning, I walked into Marjorie's office and signed the stipulation. Accredited lab. Supervised collection. Results delivered to all counsel. Entered into the estate file. Binding on every party. No withdrawals once samples were taken. My hands were steady. I want that noted somewhere, because everything after this point happens because of that signature. Mine. Freely given. Eyes open. My mother signed the same document 2 days later, and I'm told she used her good pen. If you've ever had to prove your own child to your own mother, then you know exactly why my hands didn't shake, and I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments, because for years I thought I was the only one. And stay with me here, because the trap my mother spent all spring digging for a 7-year-old was about to be inspected, certified, and stepped in, by the woman holding the shovel. While we waited for the appointment, my mother fought the war on the front she knows best, which has nothing to do with laboratories. Hartwell has one grocery store, 2 churches, and a carousel of casseroles, and information moves through it faster than the flu. She never said anything actionable, she'd just go sorrowful in the produce aisle. We're praying for clarity about the little one, you know how these clinics were, and let the town's imagination invoice me for the rest. Within 2 weeks, the mother of one of Caleb's classmates uninvited him from a birthday party with a text so carefully worded it could have been notarized. A woman from the guild touched my arm by the pharmacy counter and said, with real kindness, that whatever came out, God loved even the mix-ups. My son. A mix-up. Delivered with a pat, in the tone you'd use for a casserole that didn't set. I went home and scrubbed my sink until my knuckles ached. Here's the thing they don't tell you about a smear campaign in a small town. Fighting it feeds it. Every correction becomes a scene. Every scene becomes a story. Every story has my son's name in it. So I did my shifts, showed up to school pickup with my chin level, and smiled at women who'd already voted. But driving past the church that Sunday, watching my mother greet her ladies on the steps, gracious as a governor, I finally understood her actual strategy. She didn't need to win at the lab. The lab's answer was weeks away, and the checkout line voted daily. She just needed Hartwell to convict him first, because a town that's already sure doesn't read reports. What she hadn't counted on was who else would be standing in that lab. That week I kept reaching backward for steadier ground, and I kept landing in the same afternoon. Spring of 2022. Ruth's orchard, my grandmother 86 years old and still fitting a grafting knife to her hand like it grew there. Caleb was 3, all cowlick and mud boots, and Ruth had decided it was time. She set him on an overturned crate beside a row of wild seedling apples, bitter little trees, volunteers, nothing anyone planted on purpose. And she showed him how to cut a scion from her best Honeycrisp, how to match the green edges just so, how to bind the union snug with tape and wax. The tree doesn't ask where the branch was born, she told him, working the wrapping with her thumbs. It asks whether the edges meet. You match the living edge to the living edge and you hold it still long enough, and come summer you can't find the seam. Caleb asked, in his halting way, if the new branch was pretend. Ruth laughed so hard she had to sit. No, sir, she said. A graft takes, and it's the tree's own branch. Ask any orchard. Then she looked at him for a long moment, that August blue stare over the top of her glasses, and something moved through her face that I mistook, at the time, for ordinary love. It wasn't ordinary. I know that now. She kept a photograph of that afternoon on her refrigerator until the day she died. Caleb's small hands on the tape, hers over his. The winter of '63. A nameless December grief. An old woman teaching a boy that belonging is a thing you bind on and hold still until the seam disappears. All the clues were on that refrigerator. I just couldn't read them yet. Collection Day was a Thursday morning at an authorized site in Grand Rapids, a beige suite of offices where kinship cases go to be handled without feelings. The protocol was beautiful, honestly, if you're a nurse, and process is your love language. Photo ID checked and photocopied, photographs taken. Gloves on, seals shown to us intact, one buckle swab at a time, each one bagged and barcoded in front of its owner and signed across the seal. Caleb thought the cheek swab tickled and asked the collector, word by careful word, if the machine would know he was going to be an orchard man. She told him machines only know some things, which is the truest sentence anyone said that spring. My mother arrived like the Inspector General, correcting the receptionist's pronunciation of Callaway, narrating the importance of accuracy for everyone's benefit. And then the door opened, and Jean walked in, appointment slip in hand, ball cap in the other, apologizing for his boots. My mother's face did something I have never seen it do in 62 years of it being pointed at me. It went from porcelain to paper. Marjorie had added him to the reference panel the week before, she explained smoothly from her chair. Both of Ruth's children, to anchor the line properly. My mother stood up. She said the scheduling was irregular, said a proper process deserved better coordination, said her head was splitting actually, and perhaps her sample should be collected another day, when things could be done to standard. The collector, bless her laminated soul, said today's collection met every standard, and that reschedules would require notifying all attorneys under the stipulation. The room waited. My mother sat back down. And when her turn came, the woman who preached blood her entire life handed over her driver's license with a hand that was visibly trembling and whispered, "To nobody at all. Blood doesn't lie." You could call what happened over the next week odd if you'd never worked intake on a bad night. I'd call it symptomatic. My mother telephoned the laboratory twice that I know of, with questions about procedure. Who reviews the raw data? Whether reference samples are compared to each other or only to the child. Whether a family could simplify the analysis by withdrawing one of the reference samples, purely to reduce confusion. The lab, of course, told her nothing beyond the brochure language and referred her to counsel. I know all this because Marjorie called me, dryly, to relay the fourth question, the one aimed at her. Whether the stipulation allowed a party to pull a sample after collection. It does not. We wrote it that way on purpose, Marjorie said, and I could hear her eyebrows over the phone. I did my own due diligence because I don't sit quietly with loose ends. I asked Marjorie point blank whether a sample could be tampered with, swapped, or contaminated between that beige office and the lab bench. She walked me through the chain of custody, sealed, signed, logged, scanned at every handoff, and I checked the accreditation myself on a night shift break. The way I'd check a medication I didn't recognize. The process was sound. That was exactly what unsettled me. Because here's the clinical picture. If you laid it on my triage desk, a woman demands a test publicly, for months. The test is granted on her terms. And the moment a second reference sample enters the frame, she develops a migraine, questions the calibration, and asks, hypothetically, purely for simplicity, how to take her own evidence back out. People who are certain don't ask to unring bells. People who are cornered do. The waiting might have stayed almost bearable if the war had kept to the grown-ups. It didn't. On a Wednesday, Caleb came off the school bus with his backpack hugged to his chest like a shield, and he didn't talk through snack, and he didn't talk through dinner, and at bath time it finally came out. In pieces, the way hard things always come out of my son. A bigger kid, a cousin of a cousin on Josie's side, repeating kitchen table talk, had told him at recess that he wasn't real family, and that everybody was getting a test to prove it. He asked me if the test could take the orchard away. Then he asked, and this is the sentence that took the skin off me, if the test could take me away. I have delivered terrible news to parents in small rooms for 12 years, and I have never needed my training the way I needed it sitting on that bathroom floor. I told him the truth. In his language. I told him about the wild rose and the Honeycrisp, the living edge matched to the living edge. I told him what Great-Grandma Ruth said, and made him say it back to me until he was grinning through it. A graft takes, and it's the tree's own branch. Ask any orchard. He fell asleep holding the roll of grafting tape Jean had given him, the way other kids hold a stuffed animal, and I sat in the hallway outside his door for a long time. I've held a lot of small hands on my ward. That night I held my son's, and I made a promise with a dial tone hum to it. Whatever that lab found, he would never again be the one on trial. 3 days later, my phone rang with a Grand Rapids number. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, 3 weeks almost to the hour since collection day. I was still in scrubs in the hospital parking lot, keys in one hand, phone in the other. The woman introduced herself as a case manager with the laboratory, verified who I was, and then said the sentence I'd been bracing against for a month. Mrs. Myers, the analysis involving your son is complete. And I want to reassure you right away, that is not why I'm calling. I actually laughed, one dry cough of relief, before her tone registered. Then she chose her words the way people walk on ice. In processing the case, she said, one of the family reference samples produced an unexpected result. Under our procedures, we've rerun and confirmed it, and we're required to verify certain information about the donor of that sample before the report is released. The full report goes to the attorneys of record this week. I asked what unexpected meant. She said she wasn't able to discuss findings by phone. I asked, my voice sounding very far away, very professional, A nurse's voice. Which reference sample? There was a pause, a shuffle of paper, the sound of a decision being made about how much was already mine to know. The sample submitted as the reference for Mrs. Herrick's daughter, she said. The daughter reference. My mother. I stood in that parking lot while the sky did absolutely nothing dramatic. No thunder, no wind, just a Tuesday in Michigan going about its business, and I felt the entire chessboard rotate underneath every piece on it. My mother had demanded this test to prove my son didn't belong to her family. The lab had no questions about my son. The lab had questions about her. I drove home very slowly and I did not call her. That night, after Caleb was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and worked the problem like a lab panel, because that's what my hands know how to do with panic. Option 1. A swap. Somebody's sample mislabeled? My mother's swab confused with a stranger's. I'd watched every seal go on. Photographed, signed, barcoded, in front of us. Chain of custody wasn't a rumor to me. I'd verified the accreditation myself. Unlikely. Option 2. Lab error. Possible anywhere, but the case manager had said rerun and confirmed, and labs don't call attorneys of record over a hiccup they can quietly fix. Unlikely. Option 3 was the door I kept walking past without opening, because on the other side of it, everything in my family rearranged itself. An unexpected result in a reference sample doesn't mean the machine broke. It means the sample told the truth and the paperwork didn't. I called Gene. He'd gotten a shorter version of the same call. Meeting at Marjorie's office Thursday. Results to be presented to all parties. Please attend. He sounded like a man reading a foreign menu. What in the world do they need me for? He kept saying. I called my mother last. Straight to voicemail 4 times. My mother answers by the second ring her whole life. Missing a call, to her, is a moral failing. Wednesday morning, Marjorie phoned me herself with the update that made the hair on my arm stand up. Dana had retained separate counsel overnight. Not her estate lawyer, a new one. And his first act, before anyone had seen a single page of results, was a letter demanding the entire test be voided and every sample destroyed. She demanded this test, I said, stupidly. Marjorie was quiet for a second. Yes, she said. She did. Thursday, 10 in the morning, Marjorie's conference room, coffee, nobody drank. Jean and Pam on one side of the table, me on the other, and 2 empty chairs where my mother wasn't. She'd sent the new lawyer instead, a crisp man who took notes and gave nothing. Marjorie opened the lab's report and read it in layers, and I want to give it to you the way it landed on us. Layer 1. Maternity analysis, Tessa Myers and Caleb Myers. The probability of maternity exceeded 99.99%. My son is my son, from my body. Exactly as I'd bled to know. The donor embryo rumor died right there on page 1, in a sentence with no adjectives in it. Pam reached across the table and gripped my wrist, and I let out a breath I'd been holding since the funeral. Layer 2. And here, Marjorie slowed down. The reference panel had been analyzed for internal consistency, standard procedure. Caleb Myers and Jean Herrick, tested against an expectation of great-nephew and great-uncle. No biological relationship detected. My head came up. Tessa Myers and Jean Herrick, expected niece and uncle. No biological relationship detected. The room had gone airless, and the reference samples themselves, submitted as full siblings, Dana Calloway and Jean Herrick, daughter and son of Walter and Ruth Herrick. The data, Marjorie read, is inconsistent with a full sibling relationship, inconsistent with a half-sibling relationship, and consistent with unrelated individuals. She set the page down with the care you'd give a live wire. The laboratory's flagged conclusion, confirmed on retest. The sample submitted as the daughter reference shows no biological relationship to the Herrick family line. Jean didn't move. A fly tapped against the window glass, twice, and gave up. My mother, the keeper of the blood, the auditor of everybody's veins, was the stranger in the family Bible. Understand. The cruelty of the mechanism revealed itself in stages like frostbite warming up. First, the vindication, warm for about 90 seconds. Then Marjorie, apologizing in advance, walked us through what the law would do with this. The trust's standard, the standard my mother's own objection had invoked in writing with her good pen, was descendants of Walter and Ruth Herrick by blood. If that language were enforced literally, it did not stop with her. It ran downhill. Dana out. Me out. Her daughter. Caleb out. Farmhouse and all. The entire half of the estate on our side of the family would pour, by default, into Jean's branch. Jean, Josie, Josie's kids. The only Herricks left standing under the definition my mother had sharpened herself. Now, Marjorie said, the law has a long tradition of treating adopted children as full descendants, and that solves this cleanly, where there was a legal adoption. An adoption order? A court record? Anything. She'd already had her paralegal search. There was nothing. Whatever happened 62 years ago happened outside a courtroom, and the only paper on earth claiming Dana Herrick was born to Walter and Ruth was a home birth certificate signed by a midwife in the winter of 1963. The winter of 63. Ruth's grip on my hand in the hospice bed, fog burning off her eyes. Ask your mother. Jean drove his thumb and forefinger into his eyes and said, to the table, 62 years, in a voice I'd never heard from him. And me. I was watching a different reel entirely. The beige office, the paper-white face when Jean walked in with his appointment slip, the migraine, the phone calls about withdrawing a reference sample. My mother hadn't been afraid of the test failing my son. She'd known, the whole time, what it could find in her. My mother stayed unreachable, her new lawyer stonewalled, and the 72 hours that followed belonged to a question with a date on it. I had every legal right to be in the farmhouse. The trust named me caretaker until Caleb's 25th birthday, and my keyring had carried Ruth's brass key since hospice. But climbing her attic stairs that Friday night still felt like opening someone's chest. I went straight to the cedar box. I'd seen it my whole life on the shelf above Ruth's sewing table, always locked, always just a box, the way a landmine is just a plate. The little key was in her sewing tin, under the thimbles, where she kept every key she ever owned. Inside, in tissue paper gone gold at the creases, a newborn's knitted cap, white wool, never worn, still holding the shape of nothing. Under it, a receipt on brittle letterhead, St. Agnes Maternity Home, December 1963, boarding and confinement paid in full. The home 2 counties over that Ruth's aunt had run for 30 years. Under that, a birth certificate for Dana, home birth, Walter and Ruth Herrick listed as parents, the midwife's signature slanting hard, and a date that sat 3 weeks after the date on the receipt. And at the bottom of the box, one sealed envelope, Ruth's handwriting across the front. For Dana. I sat on the attic floor with the bare bulb swinging and Jean's voice came back to me. Mama disappeared every December, mourning somebody, never did learn who. I held the envelope a long time. It wasn't addressed to me, but the woman it was addressed to had spent the spring trying to erase my son, and the woman who wrote it had used her last clear breath to point me here. I unsealed it. Dana, my girl. If you are reading this, I am gone, and something has finally forced the door. So let me stand in it. In November of 1963, your father shipped out with the boat for the grain runs, and then straight into winter layup at the yard in Toledo, the way he did every year. Gone until April. Letters and a Christmas phone call. In December I delivered a daughter, early, at home, with only the midwife and my own mother in the room. She lived not quite 1 hour. I will not describe that hour. I have lived inside it every December since. What I did next I did out of grief and shame and the way things were done then, and I have run out of years to pretend those are excuses. My aunt ran the St. Agnes home. There was a girl there, 17, from a good family that wanted its problem to disappear. That is how we spoke about babies then, God forgive all of us. Her daughter was 3 weeks old. The midwife wrote this certificate with our names on it, and no one blinked, because no one blinks at a home birth out here in the dead of winter. Your father came up the drive in April and lifted you over his head and cried, and I watched him fall in love with you before his suitcase hit the porch, and I said nothing. That day, or any day after. You were never second best, Donna. You were the child I chose with my whole broken heart. I only found the courage to say it once, in 1986, in a hospital waiting room, for medical reasons, when they were asking after your father's heart. And I watched it turn you to stone, and I let it. A graft takes, my girl. It takes. Your mother. Every single day of it. Ruth. So now I knew everything, and knowing it helped nothing, because the machine my mother had built was still running and had no brakes. Monday brought the vice. Gene called me from his kitchen, miserable, with a stranger's business card in front of him. A lawyer named Bram Hollis had driven out to the orchard. Sought Gene out, not the other way around, having heard, the way lawyers hear, that the estate had developed an interesting genetics problem. Hollis's pitch was simple as a cleaver. Enforce the blood standard Dana herself had invoked, and Gene's branch takes the entire trust. Every acre, the farmhouse, all of it. He'd already drafted the motion. It was sitting on Gene's table next to the salt shaker, needing one signature. And here is what that piece of paper actually meant, laid out plain. If Gene signed, my mother would be dismantled in a public courtroom. Her birth certificate picked apart, St. Agnes subpoenaed, 62 years of her life read into a record any neighbor could pull. But the same motion took the farmhouse from Caleb. The same standard that unmade her, unmade my son, and me, in the same sentence. Gene knew it too, and it was tearing him up. 40 years she looked at me across a table and let me call her my sister, he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, and then went quiet, ashamed of its own anger. I don't want her scalped in a courthouse, Tessa. And I won't take that boy's trees. But Pam's watching Josie's kids get frozen out all spring, and this man says it's all or nothing. Marjorie, when I relayed it, was blunt. Get everyone to a table in 72 hours, she said, or this goes somewhere none of you can steer it. My mother had been missing from every phone and every doorstep for 2 days when I finally thought like her daughter instead of like her opponent, and drove to the cemetery behind First Lutheran. Her sedan was parked on the gravel loop, engine off, in front of Ruth's grave. The sod still seamed, the headstone so new it looked embarrassed. She wasn't at the grave. She was in the car, hands at 10 and 2, staring through the windshield at a spot 3 rows over, and when I followed her line of sight I found a marker I must have walked past 100 times in my life. A small stone, flush to the ground, no name. Just a lamb, worn nearly smooth, and a single date in December 1963, the daughter who lived not quite an hour. Ruth's December errand, kept faithfully for 62 years. I stood beside the car for a while, on the outside of the glass, and my mother didn't look at me, and for the first time in my life I saw her at her true scale. All that pedigree, all that blood doesn't lie. A woman who had spent her whole adult life standing sentry at the gate of a fortress, checking papers, because she knew better than anyone alive how easy it was to get in without them. It didn't make me forgive her. My son had cried in a bathtub because of her. There's no exchange rate that settles that. But you can refuse to forgive someone and still decline to burn them. I knocked once, on the glass. She rolled the window down maybe 2 inches. Kitchen table, I said. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Just us. And Mom. Bring your good pen. Then I walked back to my car and let her sit with it. That night I laid both roads out on my kitchen table, literally, 2 legal pads, because I am my checklists. Road 1 had a lawyer's momentum behind it and the town's appetite waiting for it. Let Hollis file, watch the standard my mother sharpened swing back through her own life in open court. She'd be stripped of the trusteeship, the pedigree, the guild, the porch step graciousness. Everything she'd used against a 7-year-old. Part of me, the part still holding a report card somewhere, wanted her to feel every degree of it. But that road ran over my son. Litigation would freeze the trust for years and feed it to billable hours. The farmhouse would hang in limbo, and Caleb's name would headline the whole circus all over again, because in Hartwell, the story would never be about Dana's birth certificate. It would be about that family and their tests. Scorched earth doesn't check whose kids are standing in the field. Road 2 had no precedent I could point to. It wasn't in Hollis's playbook, and it would never occur to my mother, which is exactly why it could work. She had spent her life converting fear into proof, demanding papers at the gate. I had one thing she'd never had at that gate, the choice not to demand any. So I wrote out 3 conditions on the second legal pad, short and clean, no adjectives. I've watched Marjorie long enough to know Mercy reads best in plain language. Then I put Ruth's letter in my coat pocket, checked on Caleb, starfished across his bed, grafting tape on the nightstand, and stood in his doorway for a minute doing the last of my arithmetic. I could finally win my mother's game. Or I could end it. In the morning, I dropped him at school, worked a half shift, and at 7 o'clock I drove the 2 miles to her house. Her kitchen hadn't changed since I was a girl. Oak table with the good wax shine, the clock with the pendulum you can hear in every silence, the chair where I'd sat for every verdict of my childhood. She'd set out coffee cups, because form is the last thing to surrender. I didn't sit in my old chair. I sat in her mother's. Then I took the envelope with the laboratory's letterhead and laid it on the oak between us, unopened, label up, and said nothing at all. My mother looked at that envelope the way people look at weather coming across the lake. Then, quietly, with the pendulum counting, she came apart. Not loudly. Nothing in my mother is ever loud, but like a seam, giving thread by thread. She told me about 1986, 22 years old, a waiting room smelling of cigarettes, her father's heart failing down the hall, a doctor asking routine questions about family history, and Ruth's hand closing over hers. I have to tell you something before you answer him. She told me what it does to a person, learning at 22 that your blood is nobody's, in an era with no word for it except the whispered ones. And then she said the sentence I expect to hear for the rest of my life. Every time I said blood doesn't lie, she said, I was listening for my own heartbeat to give me away. She'd believed the test would compare Caleb to me and stop there. She was so certain the boy was the intruder that the panel felt like formality. Then Jean walked into that collection room with his appointment slip, and she'd understood in one lurch that she had ordered the excavation of her own grave. For a moment, watching her hands shake around a cold cup, I saw the 17-year-old at St. Agnes, and the hour-old girl under the lambstone, and my mother, all 3 held by the same winter. The moment passed, her chin came up, and she reached for her checkbook. Name it, she said, pen already moving toward the amount line. The farmhouse question goes away, the fund releases, you can have the trusteeship, all of it. And we burn that letter, and this stays in this kitchen, and family stays family. There it was. The same check as before, with more zeros and more fear. And I finally saw the whole shape of her, the way you see a fever break on a monitor. Even now, cracked open at her own table, she could only imagine belonging as a transaction. Something bought, notarized, defended at a gate. I moved her checkbook to the side, gently, the way I move sharp things away from patients. I'm not selling you my silence, Mom, I said. I'm going to give it to you, and it's going to cost you the gate. 3 conditions. 1. The objection is withdrawn this week, unconditionally, in writing. 2. You resign as trustee. Marjorie takes over, and the education funds release Monday morning, Josie's kids and Caleb both. 3. Saturday. You sit in Jean's living room and tell your brother the truth. Yourself. Out loud. With me beside you. In exchange, the report stays sealed in the attorney's files where the law already keeps it, and Hartwell never hears so much as a whisper of the winter of '63 from me. Not the guild, not the grocery store, not anybody's checkout line. She stared at me for a long time. You'd protect me, she said, after what I did to that child. I'm not protecting you, I said. I'm done proving. There's a difference, and I'm 62 years closer to understanding it than you are. Then I stood, put my hand flat on the unopened envelope, and gave her back the only inheritance of hers I ever truly received. You're right, Mom. Blood doesn't lie. You did. For 40 years. I won't. I left the envelope on the oak, and I left her sitting with the pendulum, and I drove home to my son. Saturday evening, Jean's living room, the wood stove ticking, Hollis's drafted motion lying on the coffee table where it had sat all week like a pistol nobody would touch. Pam made coffee, and then stood in the doorway with a dish towel she never used. My mother sat on the edge of the couch in her navy suit, armored for the worst appointment of her life, and for once the polish wouldn't hold. She started in 1986 and had to stop. Started again at St. Agnes and had to stop. I didn't rescue her, and neither did anyone else. Some things a person has to carry across the room themselves, but she got it all out. The stillborn sister under the lambstone, the midwife's signature, the 62 years of standing guard at a gate she'd slipped through as a 3-week-old. And when she finished, she put Ruth's letter, which she had not burned, on the table next to the motion. Her hands were not steady. "Read it if you want," she said. "Your mother wrote it." Jean is a slow man on purpose. He does his thinking before his talking. He looked at the letter and at his sister, for the length of 2 full ticks of the stove. Then he picked up Hollis's motion, crossed the room, opened the stove door, and fed it in. The fire took it the way fire takes anything, indifferently, completely. "You taught me to drive the tractor when I was 9, he said, still facing the stove. "You sat up with Josie's croup when Pam had pneumonia. 63 or no 63, that's the whole test, and you passed it before I could walk." Then his voice went hard for the only second of the night. "But nobody lies in this family again. That's my condition, and it's not negotiable." My mother nodded at the floor. Monday morning, in Marjorie's office, she signed everything with her good pen. The paperwork took less than an hour, which felt almost rude, given what it settled. Objection withdrawn. Unconditionally. Trusteeship resigned. Marjorie appointed successor. The education funds released before lunch. I got the deposit alert standing at the copier, and Josie texted me a row of exclamation points from her end. The farmhouse and its 12 acres stayed exactly where Ruth had set them, in trust for Caleb Myers until his 25th birthday, his mother as caretaker. The laboratory's report went into the sealed estate file between 2 attorneys who are paid to forget things professionally. No courtroom, no headline, no scene at the grocery store. Hartwell, to this day, believes the test simply proved what tests usually prove, and finds us boring, which is the most expensive gift I have ever purchased for anyone. And it did cost me. Let me be honest with you about that, because the price is the part nobody puts in the family Bible. On the steps outside Marjorie's office, my mother stopped, gloves in hand, and worked her mouth around something for a moment. "Ruth would have picked you to hold this," she finally said, and walked to her car. That's it. That's the whole speech. I stood on those steps and understood, with a clarity that felt like swallowing a stone, that I was never going to hear the word sorry. Not for the rumor, not for the frozen fund, not for a little boy hugging his backpack on a school bus. The apology I'd been earning my entire life had never been in stock. I let it go on a Monday morning on a courthouse street, and it felt exactly like losing something, because it was. Then I drove to the school, signed my son out early, and took him to the orchard. October in Hartwell smells like cider and diesel, and this October the harvest came in heavy. On a bright, cold Saturday, Jean took Caleb out to the 12 acres, the boys' own 12 acres, to work the wild rows the way he'd promised, and I trailed them with a thermos and no intention of helping. Jean cut the scion, Caleb matched the edges, tongue between his teeth, and bound the union in tape with the concentration of a bomb technician. "It's the tree's own branch now, bud," Jean said, and Caleb repeated it to himself twice, smooth as river water, and then said an entire long sentence about rootstock without swallowing a single word of it. 8 months of therapy. Paid in full and paid forward. Out loud in the cold air. I'd have traded every acre for that sentence alone. And there was one more thing that morning, which I didn't arrange and didn't expect. My mother's sedan came up the orchard road, slow on the ruts, and parked a respectful distance out, and she stood at the fence line in her town coat, watching. She'd been that morning to First Lutheran Cemetery. I know because I'd seen what now sits against the little lambstone 3 rows from Ruth. A white knitted cap, weighted with a stone, replaced fresh whenever the weather takes it. She didn't come into the rows, and nobody made her. But Caleb saw her, and waved with the grafting tape still in his fist, and hollered, "Grandma, we're making branches." And my mother, the auditor, the gatekeeper, the woman with the pedigree inked in a Bible, lifted her hand and waved back at a boy whose blood she once demanded in writing. We are not healed. I want to be truthful with you. This is not that kind of story. She and I speak carefully, at arm's length, two porcupines managing a doorway. But it's real. All of it. The care, the distance, the fence, the wave. Nobody at that orchard is pretending anymore, and after 62 years in my family, that is not a small harvest. A few loose ends, because I know you're wondering. Ruth's letter lives with my mother now. I handed it over for good the night of the kitchen table, because leverage kept in a drawer is just a slower kind of demand, and I'm out of the demanding business. The lab report sleeps in Marjorie's fire safe. The clinic's certified records finally arrived in late summer, 11 weeks after I asked. Thorough, notarized, and completely beside the point, which is its own kind of funny. Caleb will hear the whole story when he's 18, every winter of it. The three of us agreed on that in Jean's living room, because the lying is over, but a 7-year-old doesn't owe the town his family's history. When somebody at the grocery store fishes, and in Hartwell, somebody always fishes, asks me whether the boy's got the Herrick look after all. I just smile and say he's got the family hands, good for grafting, and let them chew on it. And me. I stopped auditioning. I can't tell you the exact day it happened, but somewhere between a beige collection office and a wood stove, I resigned from the exam I'd been sitting since childhood. And the strange thing is how quiet it is out here, off the scoreboard. My mother spent her life guarding a gate because she came through it scared. I walked away from it and found out the orchard never had a gate at all. My mother demanded a laboratory prove that my son belonged in this family, and the only thing it ended up proving is what my grandmother's orchard had been saying quietly for 60 years, that belonging was never carried in the blood, but in who stays, who waters, who binds the living edge to the living edge and holds still, and who finally shows up at the fence line when they have run entirely out of things to prove. That's my story. One demand. One cheek swab. And a 40-year-old secret that fell into the very hole my mother dug for my son. If this reminded you that family is grown, not proven, take it as your sign. Hug the ones who stay. Share this video with someone who needs it today, drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.